So hello and welcome to another Can Do MS Webinar Wednesday. My name is Jessica Kaplan and I am a programs manager here at Can Do. Our topic tonight is MS fatigue explained, and we have a really great speaker joining us this evening for this topic. You can see Michelle, who I will introduce shortly. I want to take a moment to thank our generous sponsors for supporting this year's webinar series. Thank you to EMD Serono and Genentech for their support and making this possible. So our speaker tonight is Michelle Cameron. She is a neurologist and physical therapist coming to us from Oregon. Michelle, I'll have you take it away.
Great. Well, thank you, Jess, and thank you all for being here. A solid 400 plus people, so that's very exciting. We're going to speak today about MS fatigue. And overall, my objectives are that you'll understand what fatigue and MS is, which I presume most of you probably do. Many of you probably live with fatigue from MS. And then to become familiar with the causes of fatigue and to learn how to manage MS-related fatigue. What can you do about it? And that's certainly what we'll spend probably about half the time on. We have a total of about an hour together. I'll spend about 45 minutes talking somewhat at you, but I'm really excited to take questions. So definitely put questions in the Q&A box and we'll get to those at the end. I know we've gotten to a few questions even up front, so that should all work. So where are we going to go? We'll start with how common is fatigue in people with MS? How many people really have it? What is it? What causes it? Why does it even matter to try and manage it? What impacts does it have? How can we tell if we're being successful? How do we measure fatigue in MS? And then, as I said, we'll come up with a whole bunch of ideas and strategies about how you might manage your fatigue if you have fatigue. And then we'll have some time at the end for questions and answers. So let's see, what is this fatigue? How many people have it? What is it like? Let's go. There we go. So it's certainly one of the most common symptoms of MS. I'm sure all of you can tell me how many other symptoms you might have, but fatigue is most people with MS. 80 to 95% of people who have MS do experience fatigue. And as we see in the chart at the bottom of this slide, here we have some numbers of percentages of people who have sensory changes. That's probably even more common. Fatigue. Probably around 80% of people have fatigue at onset. Even right when the MS begins, they have fatigue. And then as those MS progresses and becomes more advanced, we're up into that 96, 95, 96%. So here we are, number 2 for most common symptoms. It's really, really common. Obviously, there are many, many other symptoms people may have, and you may have multiple symptoms. But probably you had fatigue when MS started, and that, along with other symptoms, might get worse or start a little later. Some people will say it's like trying to move your limbs through sand. There's just that resistance. You don't have the strength. The grogginess when you first wake up, it just stays all day. My head feels heavy, like my reactions are in slow motion. Even making a cup of coffee feels utterly draining, right? Somebody here wrote 16 hours of sleep and still feel exhausted. Showering wipes me out, and that may be from the heat. So let's move on. When we look at people who write about MS fatigue, how do they define it? It's a persistent feeling of tiredness or exhaustion. So the fact that it doesn't really quite go away, rest doesn't fix it. Your battery has run out. And then we do have this slight difference between motor fatigue, physical, I'm walking and I can't go anymore, versus I'm tired, I'm sleepy, I can't think. And both of those can coexist, but they are slightly different. And it can come on, as the last person who just popped something in, it can come on quite suddenly. So I'm going along pretty well for my day. and then, whoa, I can't keep going. And I'm seeing lots of things come up in the comments that really speak to what MS fatigue is like for you. It does tend to get worse as the day goes on. So although you may not feel wide awake and rested when you wake in the morning, as the day goes on, it may tend to get worse. It tends to come on more easily and much more suddenly than ordinary fatigue. It's generally more severe, so it comes on more quickly and it's worse. For those of you who are saying it's the shower, does tend to be aggravated by heat and humidity. So that may be something to think of. Having a rest after a shower, that you might need to take a cooler shower, sit, that can be particularly problematic. And because of all these things, because it comes on so quickly, so early, it can interfere with daily activities more than ordinary fatigue. It's one thing to be fatigued at 9 o'clock at night. It's another thing to be fatigued at 10 o'clock in the morning because you just took a hot shower. So, right, somebody said getting a shower chair really helped. So some of the things we all get to notice. Normal tiredness versus MS-related fatigue. Well, MS-related fatigue doesn't necessarily go away with rest or doesn't go away completely. And I know we got a question in advance around taking naps. So can be helpful, might help it get better with some rest, but we'll see there's some other approaches that might work even better. Comes on sooner and quicker than normal tiredness. It is particularly heat sensitive. So that's something fairly unique to MS, is getting hot makes it a problem. It can impair not just your motor function, how you move, but also how you think. So let's take a look at our next slide. What's causing fatigue? So I think this something to bring up, we'll bring it up again a little later, is, of course, many of you may have MS, and I'm seeing come through in the chat is, oh, I have MS, but I also have other medical problems. And there is a tendency, I think, by providers and sometimes patients, but I think providers even more so, of, oh, if you have MS and we don't think you have much else medical, everything must be from your MS. Well, maybe, maybe not. So it's worth looking for other fixable causes of fatigue. Are you anemic? Is your thyroid off? Could we fix those? And that would help. Or do you have a variety of other known disorders? You've had a stroke. That probably, now we've got two things that are causing your fatigue. Are these both contributing? So it can be a number of things. But if we're looking at the contribution of MS itself, what is MS doing that's contributing to fatigue? Sure, if you have other things that are giving you fatigue, those may all go together. So the disease of MS itself can give you fatigue. And it can do so, we think, from a couple of different ways. One is the chemicals that MS releases, and the other one is its damaged parts of your brain. The other parts of your brain have to work harder. And we certainly know with the chemicals, the fatigue of MS looks a little bit like the fatigue of rheumatoid arthritis, another autoimmune inflammatory disease that has a somewhat similar chemical profile. So there is these chemicals that are running around your brain, running around your system that make you tired. Like if you get the flu, you feel tired, then it goes away. So that can be a contributor. And as I said, the brain just having to work harder because some of it doesn't work well. And then we're talking about secondary things. So here's your MS. It's caused a problem, and now that problem is leading to fatigue. So what if you have spasticity or pain or bladder issues and now you don't sleep well? Well, then not sleeping well is going to make your fatigue worse. Depression. MS can cause depression independently, again, because depression comes from your brain, and if your brain is changed, that may be an issue. I see people writing medication side effects. Many medicines actually cause fatigue, and many of the medicines we use for your symptoms of MS can cause fatigue. So the medicines we use for spasticity mostly are also sedating. They may cause fatigue. Many of the medicines we use for pain are sedating. Many of the medicines we use for bladder issues are sedating. And then what if your MS has caused your muscles to be weak, you've got spasticity, you don't move quite right? So then you're physically inactive, which makes you deconditioned, which then makes you have less energy, which then cycles into less and less ability to be active. So primary, the disease itself, and then the disease causing something that then causes fatigue. And the next slide that we have will go into this in a little bit more detail, particularly these primary causes over on the left in the orange. So here we've got this inflammatory pathology of MS. It's producing chemicals, cytokines, those are chemicals, that then affect your brain and cause fatigue. On the other side, we get this loss of nerves, neurons, oligodendrocytes. Those are the cells that make the myelin, and then the connections between the nerves, the synapses. All of those aren't quite right in MS. So you lose connections, which makes your brain have to work harder, which causes fatigue. Or you can actually have lesions in the brain that affect the hormones that your brain releases, that again, now you don't have enough wakefulness. That can mess with your sleep, mess with your mood. We end up in this blue box over here with depression and sleep disturbance. Or as I said, all these secondary causes that we talked about that can then start to trickle down into affecting your sleep, or the medicines are causing sleep disturbance or causing fatigue directly. So let's think about, here we go, some more mechanisms. So inflammatory chemicals, this demyelination and neuron loss, the effort to compensate for those losses, and the regions that actually regulate your energy. So do I have lots? Do I have a little? Well, if that system isn't working right, that's going to cause trouble. And what about endocrine changes? The hormones get changed. So all of these can contribute very directly from your MS to fatigue. So how are you going to tell me or someone else, how bad is your fatigue? How do we assess fatigue? And we have a lot of ways of doing that. It is really helpful if we're going to try and manage fatigue, make it better. We need to be able to know, how bad is it now? Has it gotten better? Has it gotten worse? You try a new medicine, you try a new exercise regime. Can we follow your fatigue and get a sense for how is it doing? So I'm going to share with you a few different ways to think about that. One of them is to think about, what is its direct impacts? What time? I can't make dinner, I need help. A lot of people talked about, I have to sit when I take a shower. So taking care of the kids, taking care of the home, doing yard work or not doing yard work. What are my challenges just at home? What are my challenges at work? Am I able to keep my job? Can I work a full day? And then challenges in social settings. So what are the impacts day to day on your life? And we'll look at some of the possibilities on our next slide, but I'm sure you again have many. And I think we can look at those impacts. We could look at home, work, and social life. We can also look at these as physical, cognitive, and emotional. Physical impacts are usually challenges just getting things done, whether it's washing your hair, sweeping, just practical, doing the shopping, getting things done, doing your job. Maybe cognitive, maybe physical, depends on what your job is. Cognitive impacts. I have trouble thinking, memory, decision making. Obviously, these can affect you again at home or at work or socially. And then a lot of emotional impacts. Somebody I know brought this up in the comments, were guilt. I, I think I should contribute equally to the house, to my job, to our finances, but I can't. Feeling isolated, feeling frustrated. So fatigue hits us in a lot of different places. And I think it's worth knowing that, acknowledging that, finding help at these different levels. And that may mean I need help physically. We'll look at some of that. We may need some help cognitively. And then we may need some help emotionally to manage with this. Let's look at how we can measure it. So there are a few scales. The fatigue severity scale, it's a questionnaire. Your provider might give that to you and mark it off. And particularly, if they're going to start a medication or an intervention to manage your fatigue. Let's look at either what's called the fatigue severity scale, how bad is it, or the modified fatigue impact scale, which looks at how much does it impact you. Again, these are both questionnaires. I'll show you on the next slide the visual analog scale, but it basically says, just tell me, how bad is your fatigue on a 0 to 10? That's super helpful, and there are some nice ways to track that over time. I'm at a 9 out of 10 now. I'm at a 2 out of 10, just to keep track and to be able to tell people around you, how are you doing? I'm here. And we'll look at some ways to do that. And then there are a variety of fatigue diaries that might help you see what varies. The weekend's bad, the weekdays, Monday. If I stayed up late, what are triggers, what are patterns? So we can look at some management strategies. Let's go to our next slide. This can be really helpful, particularly as you try to monitor your own fatigue or communicate with someone else. Is that green, amber, this is a British slide, I'm British, yellow, like the traffic lights, green, yellow, red. So I'm doing great. I'm a green, full battery, I can just keep going. It's fully charged, we're all good. Hopefully that happens some of the time. You may never feel that way, or rarely. Yellow, you have to think about stopping to avoid the risk of an accident. Your battery is running low. And this is where I'd really like you to be aware. Right, somebody says, I'm never on green, always yellow and red. Is to try and pay attention when you either hit yellow if you're on green sometimes, or as you're heading from yellow to red. It's a lot harder to recover in that red zone. I've just got to stop. I'm out of charge. I have to stop right now. If you can catch it in the yellow or that end of the yellow zone, that's where naps, rest may be helpful in getting you back. Is try to catch it before it gets so bad. You can then probably recover. And to try and pace so that you stay at least in the amber zone most of the time, or the green or the amber zone. I'm looking at your comments. So I celebrate the small wins. I'm having trouble pacing. We'll see if we can come up with some ideas for those. So let's take a look at our next slide. Here's another way to track. This can be helpful to bring into your provider is, and this is very, very detailed, all day long. Where am I at from 7 to 8, every hour of the day? I rarely recommend this unless you've done some big change. This can just be, it'll be fatiguing just to follow it out. And then a diary, what did I do, may help you figure out what are the triggers. Let's go to our next slide. There are, of course, here we are in the somewhat modern age, there are digital apps, and your phone has things in it. It can have a microphone in it and voice processing and data processing. You see here in the middle, this is actually a German program. It's now translated into English. That's particularly to deal with MS fatigue, and it collects all sort of data. So there certainly are apps and new apps coming out to monitor your fatigue, potentially give you feedback, to measure not just how do I feel, but how am I performing. So we will, I think, in the years coming forward, see more and more of this. The apps, the one that up here is Elavita, and I think they're studying it. The other one I think is called My MS Symptoms. Let's move on to our next slide on how do we manage this. So I think what we've learned here so far, stuff you could have told me, is MS fatigue is common. MS fatigue is problematic. It tends to come on fast. It may go away completely. It may not go away completely, but it does fluctuate, and it's challenging to manage. So what can we do? And I really appreciated this quote. I'm certainly not saying the symptoms are gone. I just learned how to manage it a little better. So I think that's realistically what we're going to talk about here. I wish I had magic wands to make MS go away and make fatigue go away. I'm not sure that we do, but we have things that for many people, much of the time, help manage that fatigue. Some of it is about making plans. Some of it's about managing that guilt, being as okay as you can with, I can't do what I used to do. So trying to look at what we can do to do it better. So what strategies are we going to talk about here? We'll talk a bit about triggers. We'll talk about energy conservation and pacing. We'll talk about sleep hygiene, diet, and then a little bit about medications. So triggers. We talked about this at the beginning. What are the things that seem to either cause your fatigue or make your fatigue worse? Heat. Not everyone with MS has heat sensitivity, but some people do. Many people do. And if that's the case, can you be in air conditioning? Can you exercise somewhere that's cool? In the mall, in water? They always have those exercise pools for people with arthritis, and they're warm. That's probably the worst place for you to exercise. This time of year, it's probably a little easier to keep that heat down. So maybe, exactly. Some people have trouble even with being too cold, so that's less common. But cooling vests, air conditioning, just plain old cold water, but trying to keep cool can help. Stress and anxiety, if you can tell me how to make stress go away, that would be amazing. But certainly we don't need to do this alone. We can get help. There's counseling, there's friends, there's activity, things to manage our stress. Physical exertion may cause problems and solve problems. So finding that sweet spot of how much exercise gets me energized and how much exercise is exhausting. And I've seen a few people mention here, oh, I wish I could exercise. And that may be the place to go to a physical therapist to learn how to do those little baby steps that builds you up to what might be helpful in building fitness. So how much exercise can I do? How can I reverse that deconditioning cycle? And it might be you do 2 minutes on the bicycle for a week or two, and then you do 4 minutes, and then you do 6 minutes. And eventually, we've got time. You'll get to an amount that actually helps but you sort of have to invest a little up front to get there, to get to an amount of physical exercise that's enough, and to pick the right days where maybe today's not a good day, but it can't be every day that's not a good day for exercise. Poor sleep quality. So looking at what can be done about your sleep, you might need to get your sleep evaluated. You have other sleep problems. We talked a little earlier about other illnesses. So do you have a thyroid problem? Does that need to be managed? Many people mentioned many other disorders. And then acutely, if you have a bad cold or any sort of infection, that will probably make your fatigue worse. May need to be treated. You might just need to wait it out. That's not the time to push through. And then diet and hydration. Making sure you eat whatever we call a healthy diet. And I'll say right up front, we'll have a diet slide, but I don't have the magic answer to here's the right diet. There's no perfect MS diet that we know of yet. But we sort of know what's an imperfect anybody diet. Lots of processed foods, masses of sugar, lots of fast food, probably not great. Few people mentioned getting hungry, just eating regularly through the day, keeping hydrated through the day. So not getting too much, too little, and not total junk food. And right, I mean, people are mentioning diets, and there are all sorts of diets recommended for MS. None have clearly been proven to be specifically better, though some have been shown to reduce fatigue. So let's go to our next slide. So energy conservation and pacing. So this really speaks to, okay, if I don't have as much energy as I'd like to be able to do it all, but I can't do it all. So how do I spend it on what it's worth? Spend it on what's worth it to you. Okay, I really love going out at night, so I want to be able to do that. I hate doing the cleaning. Maybe I can get someone to help with that. Or maybe it just doesn't need to be that clean. Prioritize what's important. You know, do I really have to get all the dishes put away every night? No, probably not. Nothing bad's going to happen. So just letting a few things go. Your mother-in-law isn't going to come and check the house. Not today. Think about timing. When do you have the most energy? So when do I do the things that require energy? Those of you who are working, maybe you have the most energy in the morning. Do the hard tasks in the morning. Leave the boring but have to do tasks till the afternoon. Somebody mentioned a disabled plaque in your car. Do you really need to spend that energy walking from the sidewalk, driving around, finding a parking space, and then walking in the heat? Maybe not. Maybe you can get a disabled plaque and then park right up front and use the energy for something more useful, more enjoyable. Breaking tasks down into more small, manageable steps can be really helpful. You don't have to do it all today. Maybe instead of doing all the laundry at once, you do a little bit each day or every few days. Balance activity with rest. So it's pretty easy to have that list of to-dos and go, I'm going to get through it all and then I'll rest. Sometimes that doesn't work so well. Might be do half of it, take a break, and then you'll really have the energy to do the other half. Avoid that overexertion, that getting into the red zone. Try to stay in the yellow zone, take a break, and then come back. Resist that overcommitment. I should stick that as a poster on my head. Is how do we say no to things? How do we not say we'll do it when we can't? And then again, energy conservation. If you can't figure it out on your own, there's lots of help. Working with the occupational therapist can really be helpful. So, and I've certainly heard seen many people in the chat say they've worked with an occupational therapist and it's been very helpful. They often have both ideas and literally tools to help, and we'll see some of those in our upcoming slides. See our next one? So here we go. Just some things OTs come up with, whether it's physical energy, I need help just opening those cans, safety in the bathroom, all sorts of safety tools, or cognitive energy. How am I meant to remember all the things I maybe want to do? Can write it down on my phone, on the fridge, both. So lots of ideas for energy conservation, and OTs are the best. Physical activity and exercise. As I've said earlier, exercise can give you more energy to spend, but it takes a while to build up to that. So you probably will have to start at what feels like not even quite exercise to get to something that feels like exercise. But keeping your body moving with that regular physical activity will build you a greater energy bank, a greater energy resource once you get there. And this is where physical therapy can really be helpful, both to motivate you, somebody asked about that, and to get that program right, to really walk you through those steps of what's the next, what's too much, what's too little. I think keep you reassured when sometimes it's two forwards and one back, that we're still moving forwards. And that's what they're there for. And to exercise in cooler environments. Exercise itself warms you up. Let's keep going. Temperature management. So heat, we talked about that, heat sensitivity. I saw some really great ideas coming through in the chat, putting on the fan, some cooling blankets that you can get. Some people using scooters, light clothing, cooling vests. Here's even some suggestions in the chat of where to get them. A good helpful comment about the disabled plaque for your car. You don't have to be a driver to get a disabled plaque. You can get one so that someone else can drive for you. Cooling vests are expensive. Thank you, Douglas. Go naked. Somebody got to put it out there. Actually, cooling vests are probably cooler. Cooling vests can be expensive. Depending on your insurance may cover it. The VA covers it. And some of the MS support organizations, MSAA, I know, will often pay for cooling vests for a number of months of the year. There are fans, so many, many choices. So try to stay cool, particularly when you exercise, but even in between. Misting sprays. So energy conservation, aids, physical activity, exercise, temperature management, and then sleep hygiene and diet. So as we look at sleep, a consistent sleep schedule tends to work better for people. A relaxing bedtime routine. In the current political atmosphere, reading your phone may not be the best thing to do before you try to go to sleep. Managing sleep disorders. Do you have something else that's disturbing your sleep? Restless legs, sleep apnea. Caffeine. Caffeine, we'll get into medications, can certainly help keep you awake. But if you take it late in the day, it may cause you trouble with going to sleep. Alcohol, again, although it may seem to make you sleepy, can actually worsen fatigue by waking you in the middle of the night. Late heavy meals can also cause trouble with sleep. And then being dehydrated. So good to stay hydrated throughout the day. And you'll notice I don't have a lot more to say about diet. I did mention it earlier. A healthy diet is great, but what exactly a healthy diet is not entirely clear. Sleep hygiene tips, a routine, quiet, earplugs if you need it, keep it dark. Take a warm bath may be good for some people, but for those of you who are quite heat sensitive may not be. Keep the room temperature down. So really try to keep your sleep good, try to keep your diet good. An eye mask to keep it dark. And then medications. Many people spoke about medications. So I'll start in the middle of this slide. There are no medications that are FDA approved for MS fatigue. Now we'll head up towards the top here. Most medications that people take, like ones for spasticity, ones for bladder symptoms, ones for anxiety, actually tend to make fatigue worse. So one thing that's helpful is make sure your provider looks at your medicines if you have fatigue and that they are causing more trouble than they're solving. Don't change them all on your own, but you may want some changes in some medications, which aren't worth it. Medications that are used for fatigue. So people mentioned amantadine, modafinil or armodafinil, methylphenidate, caffeine, which is basically a drug. All of these increase alertness. They will make you more awake. They don't reverse fatigue. And what's the difference here? So I always say, if you don't sleep for 2 nights and you need to get a job done, you can drink 3 cups of coffee or take any of these medicines and you will stay awake. So that can be helpful. Will you still, if I ask you, do you feel fatigued? Are you tired? The answer will be yes. So helpful under some circumstances, but don't really solve the problem. Dalfampridine, brand name Ampera, can help with motor fatigue if you're having trouble moving, but not really with staying alert and awake. And be aware that all the medications used for fatigue also have their own side effects. They can cause anxiety, they can cause dependence, they can cause funny blotchiness on your legs with amantadine. There can be interactions with birth control that make your birth control work less well. So they're tricky. They're not the first place I'd recommend going, although they're also worth considering because they may be helpful for you individually. So, like many medications, they can be double-edged swords. So let's go on to a couple more slides and then I'll take some questions. Critical, and many people have mentioned this, is building a support system. You do not need to do this alone. Connect with others who understand your experience. Many of the people here had many great ideas, having lived through this. And then working with your healthcare team. They may have ideas that they hope will help your fatigue. Keep track of it so we can understand what's working, what's not, and keep adjusting. So, sure, you're tough, you're strong, but there's others here to do this with you. And then some myths and facts. Fatigue is a normal part of MS and nothing can be done about it. Not true. Fatigue may be a normal part of MS, but it can be manageable. There are things we can do that help with some strategies, some treatments, some lifestyle changes to really make it much less impactful. And then a myth, exercising will make fatigue worse. Well, if you do too much of it or too little of it, exercising can help improve your energy level, how much you have, and so reduce fatigue over time. So I just think some useful thoughts. Let me go to our key takeaways and then we'll take some questions. So key takeaways, fatigue is common but manageable in MS. There are a lot of factors that contribute to that fatigue. And there are a lot of strategies that you can use, pacing, energy budgeting, and exercise to help. And then medications and support are also available to manage fatigue. And I thank you for this, and we'll take some questions.
Great. All right. Thank you, Michelle, for that really wonderful and helpful and informative presentation. And it's been really cool to see so many people engaged in the comments as well and just sharing ideas back and forth. Before we get into those questions, I just want to put a plug out there for taking our survey for this program. It's really helpful for us if you take this survey. It allows us to improve upon future programming. The survey will pop up at the end of the webinar if you can fill it out then. I'm also going to drop the link in the chat now if you'd be able to fill that out at the end of the program. Okay, and now we will jump into some questions. So there's a lot of good ones that have been sent in the Q&A part of the program here. A lot of the ones we've gotten are about rest and basically naps. So are naps an effective tool to use to manage MS fatigue? And if not, what can we do instead? You know, if rest doesn't fix fatigue from MS, what can we do instead in that moment?
Sure. So I think naps can be very helpful, or rests, whether you sleep or not. The critical thing about that rest, the nap, is to try and, as I said, sort of take it in that yellow zone before you get to red, before you're just completely wiped out. And so to take breaks, and for you, a break might be a nap. For someone else, a break might just be sit down with a cup of tea. But to at least take a break and try to take those breaks before you've hit your max exhaustion can be really helpful.
Great. All right, thank you. Another one we have here is, why is it that my MRI shows no further progression, yet my fatigue and other symptoms feel like they're getting worse? It makes me feel like I'm making it up. I know that a lot of people feel that way.
Right. So MS has these sort of two main characteristics. One of them is what common in relapsing MS and predominates, which is inflammatory, and new lesions show up on MRI. And MRI therefore picks that up. It changes. But the other part of MS is more degenerative, is yes, your brain may be shrinking a little bit, bits of it may not be working quite as well. The MRI doesn't pick that up as well. So your MRI might look pretty much the same, but your MS is still progressing. And that progression then shows up as fatigue and other symptoms. Somebody put smoldering MS, progressive MS, and we used to think of it as you have relapsing, you have progressive. And what we now understand better is that progression is probably there from the get-go to some extent. The relapses are superimposed on it and predominate. As the relapses sort of peter out, that progression continues and may even accelerate.
Okay. Okay. Another question we have here, is it okay to take natural herbal supplements to help with your fatigue?
Excellent question. And I mean, there's all sorts of versions of this question. Can I take CBD? Can I take this? Can I take that? You really just need to talk with your doctor about what you want to take, because you may be on a bunch of other medications. I specifically learned a lot about cannabis use and when it can be used in people with MS. Cannabis and CBD interact with other medicines and make them not work. So we really need to know if you're going to be doing that, especially if you take anything else. So talk with your provider and work with them together to figure out, hey, I want to take this supplement. Is it safe for me? Might it work for me? Don't just take them and not tell anyone.
Here is another good one. How can fatigue be described to someone who doesn't experience it?
I think for each person, it's different. I think sometimes what's most helpful is to say, you know how you feel at the end of the day when you're about to go to bed? That's how I feel at the beginning of the day, or all through the day, or after you dug the yard all day.
Mhm.
It's more physical. How you feel after 10 miles is how I feel before 10 miles.
I think there were a lot of good ones in the chat as well. I think I saw somebody
Yeah.
say it's like moving their limbs through porridge, and that
Yes.
was a good mental image. So scroll back through the chat. I think some people had some ideas as well. Okay. Okay. Another one is, can you get a reasonable accommodation for work as it is related to MS fatigue?
Ooh. When we throw legal questions at me, I go, I'm not a lawyer. I'll give you a maybe. Um,
I like that.
and also reasonable accommodation depends both on whether you can, it depends on whether you can do essential job functions and whether they can reasonably accommodate you. So it depends on your employer as well. Your employer, your particular job, etc. So it is quite complicated. It's worth asking the question and looking at all of those pieces.
Mhm. Okay, here is someone looking for ideas on how to get things done in the house when maybe you live alone and there isn't anybody there to help you with those everyday things.
So I think that's a great time to go to occupational therapy, the OTs, who'll have very specific ideas for you. I mean, I don't know, do you live in a single story place, in an apartment? Do you have to walk up to the place? How many rooms? Do you have a pet? So all of those details can really make a difference. I know I was chatting with someone just earlier today about I do a lot of work on fall prevention in MS. And we did a lot of things where we tried to educate people about how to prevent falls. And we got people in big classes and we had them all learn the same things and all exercise together. And you know what that did? Kind of not much. Wasted a lot of people's time, sadly. It turns out that each one of you is a little bit different, and what you need is a little bit different. And when we can individualize that education, we make a lot more difference. So it's worth the time to go, okay, I know this is my problem. I have my house and I need to take care of it. I'm on my own. Come with that specific question, and will probably exactly precision medicine be able to give you better answers. And I hope some of what I've spoken about today speaks to each of you in some way. But to get into the specifics, whether it's medication or should I eat more or should I take this supplement, each one of you is that little bit different. And we really need to get to know you personally and what matters. And often, sadly, make mistakes and tweak. Try a little of this, see how it works. That helped, that got worse. Let's try a little more of that
Mhm.
until we get to a sweet spot for a while. And then we have to tweak again.
Right. A lot of trial and error, it sounds like.
Right.
Right. All right. Here's a question I can answer. Is this being recorded? So, yes, the webinar is recorded, and you will get a follow-up email after the program with a link to the recording of it. So, it'll probably come sometime tomorrow. You'll get a link to the recording.
I did like the robot vacuum suggestion.
I saw that too. Yep. Great suggestion. Okay. So, here's a couple questions about how different things might contribute to MS fatigue. And seems like asking the mechanisms of why do they contribute, why do they affect or make it worse. So one is, why do we believe that stress contributes to MS fatigue? And the other one is, why does the weather contribute to fatigue? So that hot and cold, why is it that it makes things worse?
So the hot and cold, I think we understand a little better than stress. So I'll speak to that. So one of the problems in MS is, and probably you all learned this, is that your nerves don't have myelin or all the myelin on them that they used to. So your nerve is like a wire and the myelin is like wrapping on it, insulation. When you lose the insulation, the nerves don't conduct quite right. And then when they get warm, they conduct even more poorly. The heat actually affects that nerve conduction, and your nerves aren't adequately insulated. And so it makes them not work right, or not work right, even worse. So it's that demyelination that's making your nose more exposed. So that's the heat one. The stress one, probably hormones. What does that mean? That means chemicals that run all over your body. So if you think of, if you're stressed, you release a lot of adrenaline. So now you're hyped up. Then you lose it. So then you're exhausted. So those things all get shifted with stress, and probably that adds to what's already going on with MS.
Thank you for that. Okay, it's like maybe we have time for one or two more.
Great.
Let's see.
I see lots of them, but I'll let you pick.
I know if you see one that you'd like to answer, feel free to go.
Sure.
I'm scrolling through all of them. But if you see one that you want to grab, go for it. Otherwise, why don't we take the one on exercise? So how do you balance exercise? Um, this person is walking for 25 minutes, but then their fatigue is really strong for the next 12 hours. So I guess how do you determine what is too much exercise and what is beneficial to you?
I think the trickiness about balancing the right amount is, if you're tired after you exercise, that's fine. If you're more tired even 24 hours later, that was too much exercise. I'd rather we didn't have to shuttle back and forth between a lot of trial and error, and that's where a physical therapist can come in, which is, I see a fair number of people do this yo-yo of, I don't exercise at all. Oh, I better get back to my exercise. I'm going to go to that hour class at the gym. And then you're knocked out for 3 days. And then you're like, well, exercise is terrible. I'm not going to exercise again for another 3 months. Oh, I feel bad. I should exercise. And so trying to figure out what are the tiny bite-sized pieces that are enough for me.
Okay, well, thank you, Michelle, for taking so many questions and for just presenting so much information. This has been a really wonderful webinar. I want to thank everybody for attending. I want to again thank Michelle for spending the time here with us today. And one last time, we'll thank our sponsors, EMD Serono and Genentech.
Great. And thank you all for me. I really appreciated all the input, all the questions. It was really a pleasure. And thank you to Jess and Can Do MS.
All right, goodbye, everyone. Have a great night.